Living in space? Not as glamorous as you would think. On this day in history, November 2nd, 2000, the first crew members arrived aboard the International Space Station for a residency. In 1998, space agencies from the United States, Canada, Japan, Russia, and Europe agreed to collaborate on space research missions. So aboard 5 space shuttles and 2 uncrewed Russian flights, core components were launched into orbit and used to assemble the space station. Eventually, a crew had to be chosen to live on the ISS and bring its core functionality online. Roscosmos astronauts Yuri Gidzenko and Sergei Krikalev, alongside NASA's Bill Shepard, with the selected crew, traveled to the ISS aboard the Expedition 1 mission, launched aboard a Russian Soyuz rocket from Kazakhstan. Unlike the crews of subsequent missions, the crew of Expedition 1 were tasked with constructing, installing, and activating components while living on the station. Being in space, this task was easier said than done, as it took over a day to activate one of the food warmers due to the complexity of the required setup. While in space, the crew was visited and resupplied by 2 uncrewed Russian rockets and 3 space shuttle missions, which brought additional supplies such as photovoltaic arrays that would eventually provide the ISS with most of its power. The ISS circled the Earth around 15.5 times a day, and Shepard, Gidzenko, and Krikalev became the first humans to adjust to life in low orbit, including exercising for 2 hours a day to offset muscle atrophy caused by low gravity. The crew lived and conducted research on the ISS for 5 months until the Space Shuttle Discovery docked with the ISS on March 10, 2001, bringing aboard 3 astronauts known as the Expedition 2 crew to replace them as residents. Since 2000, several modules, all to conduct research in biology, material science, and the feasibility of future space travel, have been built on the ISS, and 236 people from 18 different nations have visited and lived on the station, with plans to continue until 2030.